Good afternoon, everyone. It's just gone 5 minutes past 12, so we will make a start. Can I firstly welcome everyone to today's Lunch and Learn with a focus on improving educational outcomes for children and young people in contact with the child protection system. For those who don't know me, my name is Stuart Moucher. I'm the Acting Executive Director for Family and Community Services, Insights, Analysis and Research, otherwise known as FACSIAR, with the Department of Communities and Justice. Before we begin, importantly, I would like to acknowledge that wherever we are joining from today, from across New South Wales, that we are all living and working on Aboriginal land. I would personally like to acknowledge the First Nations people of the Elwood area, where I have the privilege of joining you from today, that being the Vegigal people. I would like to acknowledge and pay respects to all First Nations elders, past and present, and I would like to acknowledge future and emerging leaders. I'd also like to extend that respect to our many Aboriginal colleagues joining us today. I think it's also equally important in today's conversation to acknowledge, as we talk about children in contact with the child protection system, that there is a terrible overrepresentation of Aboriginal children that are caught in that group. And that come into contact with the child protection system. And I think it's important that we all hold that in the front of our minds, as well as our collective responsibility to work in partnership with Aboriginal families and communities to achieve better outcomes and to close the gap of that overrepresentation. So again, with that, I guess, can I warmly welcome everyone participating in today's Lunch and Learn, in particular our speakers. And also I'd like to acknowledge and welcome our many colleagues who work directly in supporting children and young people and their families in one of our DCJ districts or with one of our many not-for-profit partners. So today we know that children and young people who are known to the child protection system are at far greater risk of experiencing poor educational outcomes compared to their peers, which is why it's so important that we know about the latest research in this area to inform our work and to help us find ways to support these children to achieve their potential. We also know that when children achieve educational outcomes, it can go a long way to breaking intergenerational cycles of disadvantage. So in a moment, I will introduce to you all of our presenters so that we can then flow through the presentations without needing to stop. And you will have already noticed from the agenda that we have an incredibly impressive lineup this time around. So firstly, a small apology. This program does run a little longer than normal, but I really do hope everyone can stay with us for the entire hour and a half and hope it will be worthwhile. Two bits of housekeeping. Again, want to make sure everyone's aware that today's session is being recorded. And at the end of today's session, the final agenda item, I will run a bit of a Q&A with our presenters. So please pop any questions or comments in the chat as our presenters are presenting today, and I will put those questions to them at the end. So to start this webinar, you will first hear from our research partners who will present the latest research on this topic from the Pathways of Care Longitudinal Study and also the New South Wales Child Development Study. In a moment, I will invite Dr. Miriam Maclean to kick us off, who will present her findings from the Pathways of Care Longitudinal Study. Dr. Maclean is from the Australian Centre for Child Protection at the University of South Australia, and her talk is entitled Education and Children Who Experience Care, Exploring Higher Achievement, Trajectories Over Time and Predictors in the Pathways of Care Longitudinal Study. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Michelle Townsend, who will present her findings also from the POCL study. Dr. Townsend is a Senior Research Fellow from the University of Wollongong School of Psychology, and her talk is titled, Are We Making the Grade? Education and Children in Out-of-Home Care. Following Dr. Townsend, we will all hear from Dr. Kristen Lawrence, who will present findings from the New South Wales Child Development Study. Dr. Lawrence is an Associate Professor and ARC Future Fellow from the Queensland University of Technology's School of Psychology and Counselling. And she will speak about primary school outcomes for children in contact with child protection during early childhood. Now, after we hear from our about three sets of research findings, we'll then hear from representatives from the Department of Communities and Justice and also the Department of Education to discuss relevant programs and strategies. First, we have Rochelle Romero, who is the Acting Manager for the Interagency Team in Child and Family with the Department of Communities and Justice, and she'll be speaking about the educational pathway program for children in out-of-home care. Next, we'll then hear from Tricia Ladonga, who is the Director of the Behavioural Strategy at the New South Wales Department of Education, and she will talk about inclusive, engaging and respectful schools. And finally, we will hear from Jade Ward, who is the Director for Transforming Aboriginal Outcomes within the Department of Communities and Justice, and she will be discussing how best to support Aboriginal children and young people in care to reach their educational goals. Following these presentations, we are very fortunate to be joined by Irena Castellano. Irena is a carer and also a volunteer with My Forever Family, and she will be presenting a carer's perspective on how to support children to achieve their educational outcomes. And as I mentioned before, at the end of all this, we will host a Q&A session with our presenters, so please pop any of those questions in the chat. With that, I think that's more than enough from me. So can I please introduce and hand over to Dr. Miriam Maclean. Over to you, Miriam.
Thanks very much for the invitation to present our research today. As mentioned, I'm a research fellow at the Australian Centre for Child Protection, and I'm on Noongar land today. We know from previous research that children who have been in out-of-home care often have low educational achievement. And this can flow over onto their adult outcomes with risks for things such as unemployment, social exclusion, and financial instability. Nonetheless, some children who experience out-of-home care do well in school. There's been several studies looking at university entrants who have been in care, reflecting on the kind of factors that might have helped them succeed in school. But there have been few studies looking at younger children, so children who are still involved in the child protection system, still involved in school, to look at how many children within the cohort are achieving highly and what are the factors associated with that. We also wanted to explore children's trajectories over time, and in particular, whether the children who were achieving well. Can you not hear me? Is that better? Let me know if there's any other sound issues, please. Great. So some children nevertheless do well, and we're wanting to find out more about whether the children, thanks very much. I got a message come through that there were some sound issues, so just wanted to check. So amongst the children who do achieve highly early on in primary school, are they able to maintain this high achievement, or do we see the same sorts of declines that we see amongst other children in previous research? So the Pathways of Care Longitudinal Study is a longitudinal study, a large-scale study that recruited children who entered out-of-home care in May 2010 through to October 2011, and it's continued to follow them up over time since then. So we used the linked administrative data from Maclean and also the child protection and out-of-home care data, along with carer surveys and standardised assessments of children's cognitive and behavioural well-being. So for our first study, we looked at higher achievement, which we defined as being in the top 3 bands of the NAPLAN amongst the Year 3 students. This is quite a broad and inclusive measure. We also wanted to look at any characteristics of the child, their child protection history, out-of-home care placements, carer characteristics, and services and supports that were associated with higher achievement. So overall, we found that 46% of the children in our sample who'd experienced out-of-home care scored in the higher achieving group. This is quite a lot lower than the general population, where the figure is around 3/4. But nonetheless, it showed that at the Year 3 level, almost half of the children in care, who had been in care either way, had been achieving at a fairly comfortable level of reading. We found that the students who were achieving more highly were a diverse group. They weren't a unique subset of children who had, say, really high IQs or necessarily came from a more socioeconomically advantaged area. They were a very diverse group of children, and they shared many of the same adversities and challenges and characteristics found amongst the children in general. Logistic regression identified several factors that were significantly associated with higher achievement in Year 3. These included average or above average cognitive test scores and normal range behavioural well-being, in particular externalising behaviour on the child behaviour checklist. Another factor was having a carer who was highly educated, and we found higher levels of higher achievement amongst non-Aboriginal students than Aboriginal students. The achievement gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students is well established. And so what we wanted to do was focus more on looking within the group, so within Aboriginal children in the cohort, which children were doing well and what were the factors associated with that. Again, amongst the higher achieving Aboriginal children, we found that they shared many of the same characteristics and challenges as the lower achieving students in the Pockles. We did find from the logistic regression that older carers were less likely to have children in their care with higher achievement. So exploring this more, we found that amongst the Aboriginal children in kinship care or relative care with older carers, higher achievement was less common. Now, these families often have a number of characteristics linked with lower reading achievement, including living in more disadvantaged areas. A higher proportion of them were boys. There were less educated carers, and also the carers were less likely to have participated in carer training over the last year. On the other hand, the children in this group showed better behavioural wellbeing scores as rated by the carer on the child behaviour checklist. So realistically, many of these carers would be grandparent carers who have taken on the enormous responsibility of looking after another generation of children. So we need to think about how can we better support and enable them in this role. So policy and practice implications. It's really important to support the cognitive development and the social and behavioural development of these children from early on and over time. The out-of-home care pathways, both education pathway and health pathway, provide a process which can be used for on-entry assessments as well as intervention and monitoring. And this needs to be done in a culturally appropriate and timely way. There were several carer factors associated with reading achievement. Some researchers have proposed using a recruitment focused on more highly educated carers, whereas others have used programs that support carers who might be more intimidated by the education system to feel confident in supporting the children in their care with their education. The second part of our study looked at trajectories over time. So we used late in class growth modelling, which identifies groups of children with similar trajectories of reading achievement over time. We conducted it separately, and for the non-Aboriginal students, we found 3 different reading trajectories came up in the modelling, as well as in the grey line, we showed typical student development in reading over time. So 12% of the children in the non-Aboriginal group were classified as a higher achieving group. These students had well above average achievement in Year 3, and they had typical levels of reading growth over time. So by Year 7, they were still achieving above average. There was also a lower and a middle level of achievement, which had lower achievement early on and slower growth. Amongst the Aboriginal students, there was a high but declining pattern of achievement, and this was characterised by scores that were quite above their year level for Year 3, so above average, but by the time they were in Year 7, they weren't keeping pace and they were only slightly above average in that year level. We also found a low level of achievement trajectory, which was characterised by low achievement and slower growth. So overall, we found that many of the students who experienced out-of-home care did not keep pace with their peers, regardless of their starting levels of achievement. So we recommend a target of 1 year's reading growth for each year of school. There's also clearly a need for more support for Aboriginal children who are achieving highly, if they're to be able to support, if they're to be able to maintain this level of achievement over time. Around 1 in 8 of the children were in high trajectory groups, and it's sometimes easy to forget about these children, but it's really important to give specific consideration to how these children can be helped as they progress through high school and potentially into higher education if that's what they want. We found only around 1 in 4 of the students were reported to have received tutoring in the past 6 months before a survey. And this is despite the fact that many students were not keeping pace with their peers, and many of them had low reading scores. Previously, intervention research has shown tutoring to be an effective way of helping kids who are in care or have been in care to improve their reading and other academic work. So this is something that may be beneficial to use more widely. With the other supports and services that we included in our study, the results were mixed. They were significant in some analyses, but not consistently. So we'd always be cautious in drawing conclusions from mixed results like this, but there was some evidence, for example, that positive family connections with birth fathers and siblings may be linked to higher educational outcomes. So this again demonstrates the importance of looking at the whole child, their relationships, their emotional well-being, behaviours, social factors, and of course also their cognitive and academic development. So of course a study of this size involves a lot of people and organisations, and I'd just like to acknowledge the work of everyone involved. Thank you. And then I'll pass you over to Dr. Michelle Townsend.
Thanks, Miriam. Hi, everybody. I would like to start my presentation today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we all meet today and pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to extend my respects to any of the Aboriginal people that are here today. And I'd like to recognise and celebrate diversity in all of its forms, and acknowledge that there may be some of us here today that have lived experience of childhood maltreatment or have spent our lives caring for those in caring and professional capacities. So the presentation I'm going to give today is going to draw on some of the data from the Pathways of Care Longitudinal Study, and I've been looking at research around children and young people in out-of-home care now for probably about the last 15 years, and I'm just going to share a couple of the key messages that I'd like to leave you with. So the presentation is drawing on some of the survey and interview data with carers and with young people, as well as looking at the Australian Early Development Census, which is undertaken in kindergarten, and the NAPLAN program, as well as some of the caseworker surveys that were undertaken in Wave 2. So the literature in Australia shows pretty consistently that children that are in out-of-home care, when they come into the school systems, they are at some risk educationally. And certainly the 15 years of research shows that once in the education system, children out of home care tend to perform more poorly than their peers and leave school with fewer qualifications. Where there is a bit more debate is about what's the reasons behind that. And, you know, there is explanations that children's pre-care experiences, childhood adversity and trauma are the real drivers behind their poorer educational outcomes. But there's also factors within the out-of-home care system that contribute to that as well. Placement, school instability, low expectations that are sometimes given to children in out-of-home care. But more recently, the research suggests that, yes, there is pretty strong evidence that children are entering the out-of-home care system with a range of adversities that are impacting, but that as professionals working and the systems working together, we really need to do more to be able to improve their outcomes. So I'll start with the Australian Early Development Census, which is a standardised tool that most children across Australia will experience when they're in kindergarten, which their classroom teachers ask them 100 questions that measure across 5 domains: physical health and wellbeing, social competence, emotional maturity, language and cognitive skills, communication skills and general knowledge. And what we know about this census is that it can predict children's progression in terms of educational outcomes, particularly NAPLAN, across primary school and potentially even further. So in the Pathways of Care study, we found that about just over a third of all boys at kindergarten and a quarter of all girls were vulnerable on 2 or more of those domains that I just talked about. And this is about 3 times higher than all Australian children. At this point in time, at the start of schooling, there was no significant differences between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal children in our cohort. But what we did find is that children that were developmentally vulnerable on 2 domains were more likely to have spent time away from school for absences, which were for a range of different reasons. But this is in their first 5 months of schooling. So it's an important thing to be able to pick up on because they're, missing out on schooling at a very early stage. Next, I'd like to look at NAPLAN, which is the national testing program that is in year 3, 5, 7 and 9 of schooling. And these tests are really to look at what sort of literacy and numeracy skills the students should have at that point of their schooling and whether they're achieving what we'd expect as a minimum standards to be able to continue to progress with their schooling. So we found that, unsurprisingly, that NAPLAN reading and numeracy results for all children in the study was substantially lower than New South Wales children across every year, 3, 5, 7 and 9. But the greatest difference was by year 9, which suggests there's some compounding of educational disadvantage for this group of students. We also found that by the time that students were in year 9, far fewer were actually sitting NAPLAN. So there was only less than 70%, whereas for all students, it's well above 90% will sit NAPLAN in year 9. And Aboriginal children were significantly more likely to not sit both year 7 and year 9 NAPLAN. We also found that the increased number of developmental vulnerabilities at the start of school led to NAPLAN scores being lower. So the first message I'd just like to share with you today is that it's really important we don't wait to intervene. Issues become entrenched in terms of education and then they're much more difficult to overcome. And so one of the clear ways that we can really think about children's education is through individual education plans. And I'm suggesting that here's some key points that I think would be really helpful from what we know from the research to be able to review. So post the Australian Early Development Census in kindergarten, at year 6 preparing for high school, after NAPLAN results are available, if they change school or placement, so that we bring the new education and the carers on board with what's happening for this child and their education. And really when a child is achieving just at or below, because remember thinking it is a minimum benchmark standard, it's important that we then look at assessing for what sort of more broadly around the educational needs of these children and intervention that's required within both school and outside of school. So the second area I want to turn to is student wellbeing. We know that across all children and young people that higher levels of wellbeing leads to better mental health, more year 12 completions, and that the lifelong outcomes can flow on from that. So within our cohort, what we learned is that the education and wellbeing is really entwined, and for the children that had more risk of significant harm reports, that they were likely to score lower on their NAPLAN results, and that the higher number of risk of significant harm reports, they're associated with negative reactivity, internalising, externalising, and overall problem behaviours in time. We also found that a lot of our cohort had experienced a fair amount of instability in their schools. So about 5 or 6 years after they'd entered out of home care, they'd experienced on average of 3.7 schools by the time they were in high school. And we found a fifth of all the children aged between 12 and 17, so high school age, said that they rarely or never or only sometimes understood the work in class. And then another quarter said that they rarely or never completed homework or assignments on time. So that's, real flags to say that some of these children are having difficulties. Carers also reported that primary school children, about a quarter of them had problems, academic or other, at school, and this increased to over a third for high school age students. And we start to understand this when we look at the child behaviour checklist, which you can see is put into clinical and borderline over time. And while there is some decrease, there's still a large proportion of our children that do have difficulties with internalising behaviours, externalising behaviours, and total problems. So my second key message is just around, we know that child protection history, psychological wellbeing and educational outcomes are really interrelated, and we can see quite a clear flow-on effect in terms of educational outcomes. And we can't change children's early life experiences, but we can take actions to enhance their wellbeing and education. And by working together collaboratively with schools, educators, carers, and the children themselves, we really stand a better chance of being able to support them to achieve better with their education. And the other point that showed up from the research that I've undertaken is that this group of children can have self-regulation issues, poorer social skills, and difficulties in relating to others that stem from their early life experience, and that showed up in kindergarten. And so thinking about how we can support their development around increasing their communication skills, problem solving and self-control would be beneficial. And there's certainly a large group of children that are going to need some form of ongoing psychological support so that they can work through their early life experiences. And then the final message I'd just like to leave you with is just thinking about, I know that in, the everyday compliance and, all the demands that are placed on everybody's roles, it can be difficult to always hold the big picture. But I do believe that education is one of our really important drivers of being able to change future trajectories. That may even have a flow-on effect to this group of children's own children. We know that South Australia research that's been looking at intergenerational child maltreatment shows that low socioeconomic status and mother unemployment are some of the drivers of increasing child protection involvement for their children. And education is such a great way to be able to support people to address being able to get employment and having a stronger socioeconomic status. So we really need to think about how we can support and resource wellbeing and educational needs to allow this group of children to reach their full potential. So in summary, my three key messages just around monitoring and intervening early, taking actions that really support children and young people's wellbeing, and to hold the big picture in mind, because we really are facilitating long-term outcomes. So I'd just like to say thank you to everybody that was involved in this study and has supported the research. And I'd now like to welcome Dr. Kristen Lawrence, who's going to do the next presentation.
Thanks very much, Michelle. And thanks for the opportunity to share with you some of the work from the New South Wales Child Development Study, in which we examine educational outcomes for children in contact with child protection services during the primary school years. And I'd like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yuggera peoples as the traditional owners of the lands from which I present today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So today I'm going to present findings from our investigations of the relationship between children's contact with child protection services and their academic attainment during primary school, as indexed by reading and numeracy skills at the 3rd and 5th grades. And I'll also report on the relationship we've observed between child protection services contact and likelihood of receiving a suspension from primary school during the 3rd through 6th grades. Now, this research uses data from the New South Wales Child Development Study, which is a longitudinal investigation following the development of a large population cohort of children using anonymised linkage of administrative records. In successive waves of linkage conducted as the children develop, we've linked records for over 91,000 children and over 72,000 of their parents, bringing together data relating to health and development, education, child protection and justice. And you can find more detailed information and access publications from the study at the study website provided on the slide. Today, I'm going to describe the relationship between child protection contacts that occur during early childhood, so prior to school and up to the end of the 2nd grade, and academic attainment and school exclusion outcomes occurring from then until the end of primary school, so the 3rd through 6th grades. Now, when we look at educational and other outcomes for children in our sample who are in contact with child protection services, we typically distinguish 5 levels of contact. Now, the numbers of children represented at each level of our contact hierarchy varies a little across studies because it's influenced by what other data we have available for linkage. So, for example, we have access to records on out-of-school suspensions only for children educated within the public school sector and not for children attending Catholic or independent schools. So in general, we see that the majority of children in the sample have had no contact with child protection services during early childhood, so about 4 in 5 children. About 1.5% of children are placed in out-of-home care. Approximately another 2% of children had a substantiated risk of significant harm report, indicating actual harm or risk of harm verified by child protection caseworkers who were not removed from home. A larger portion of children, just over 1 in 10, had an unsubstantiated ROSH report, and these were children that met the threshold for further investigation, but risk of harm or actual maltreatment couldn't be sufficiently determined, or the case wasn't prioritised for investigation owing to resource constraints. And finally, almost 4% of children had reports that didn't meet the threshold indicative of risk of significant harm, and they were not further investigated. So we looked at these different levels of contact with child protection services in relation to educational outcomes, comparing these outcomes for children at each level of contact to outcomes for the largest group of kids who were not reported to services. And all of our analyses also consider a wide range of other factors that are more common in children reported to child protection and or are associated with the educational outcomes themselves. So this means we could examine the relationship between child protection, contact and educational outcomes while taking into account the effect of these other factors. And these included demographic variables, parental and perinatal factors, and early developmental vulnerabilities and other factors that indicate additional service needs for children. So looking first at our educational attainment outcomes, we examined how child protection contact related to both below average and above average achievement relative to average achievement on the National Assessment Program for Literacy and Numeracy assessments that almost every child nationally completes during 3rd and 5th grades. In our study, the factors that increased the likelihood that children would attain below average relative to average on reading and numeracy also tended to be the factors that reduced the likelihood that they would achieve above average on these skills. So I'm just going to focus today on the results in relation to below average achievement. Now, a publication reporting these data and an evidence to action note that we produced with Carolyn Anderson and Natasha Allen in FACSIAR, which summarises these findings in terms of their relevance to practice and policy in child protection services, are both available online. And I'm grateful to Carolyn and Natasha for their efforts in making our findings more readily accessible to professionals and public. So this snapshot taken from the evidence to action note nicely summarises the relationships we see between each level of contact with child protection relative to children without services contact. So in terms of below average reading and numeracy attainment. The basic associations, before we take account of those many other factors that we examined alongside child protection contact, indicate that children at all levels of the contact hierarchy are more likely than their unreported peers to attain below average reading and numeracy. The relationship is strongest for children in out-of-home care and tends to reduce as the level of contact with services reduces. The children placed in out-of-home care are 3 to 4 times more likely than their unreported peers to attain below average academically. But even children who were reported but did not meet the risk of significant harm threshold experienced a doubling of their likelihood relative to unreported children to achieve below average during primary school. And when we simultaneously consider all of the other factors in our analyses, you can see that the relationship between child protection contact at all levels and academic achievement reduces in strength. Now, children in out-of-home care actually have similar levels of risk to unplaced children in contact with child protection, but there's still a greater likelihood of underattainment for all children reported to services, suggesting all of these children might benefit from additional support for their learning. So turning now to examine the exclusion of children via out-of-school suspensions. In our sample, about 4% of children enrolled at a public primary school received at least one suspension, and most commonly this was for aggressive behaviour or continued disobedience. These events are important because research demonstrates that children who receive suspensions from school are more likely to disengage and drop out of school, to experience poor academic achievement and mental health, and increased involvement with the criminal justice system and adulthood economic disadvantage. So in our analyses, when we looked at the relationship between the different levels of Child Protection Services contact and early suspensions from school, while simultaneously examining those many other factors that also relate to school exclusion, we again observed strongly increased likelihood that children in out-of-home care and children with substantiated child protection reports would receive at least one suspension. And indeed, over a quarter of children in out-of-home care and 1 in 5 children with substantiated reports experienced early suspension. But note that the children with unsubstantiated reports and children with sub-threshold ROSH reports were also significantly more likely than their unreported peers to receive suspension. So again, these findings point to the need to be providing adequate supports for all children reported to child protection. We're currently working with Carolyn Anderson and her colleagues in FACSIAR to summarise these findings in an evidence to action note. But in the meantime, if you're interested in further detail regarding the study, I refer you to our recent publication, and that's available via the link in the slide. Now, our findings offer some important insights for policymakers and professionals in child protection and education in particular. All children reported to Child Protection Services would benefit from supports to engage effectively with learning at school. Now, some of these supports might include personalised education plans at school, and these are currently available for children placed into out-of-home care. But these need to be augmented by health and social services support from government and non-government agencies provided both prior to and during the first years of school. Given the range of adversities that these vulnerable children experience, this shared approach across education, child protection, health and allied services is really important. And schools also need to be adequately supported so that alternative disciplinary strategies to suspension might be enacted. And I acknowledge the work done by my colleagues in the Department of Education in New South Wales over the past few years in developing a new student behaviour strategy, which I believe Tricia will talk about later. Our findings would suggest that school disciplinary policy reform might include prohibiting primary school suspension for students known to Child Protection Services for all but the most serious infractions. And to finish, I'd like to acknowledge the co-investigators on the New South Wales Child Development Study, including our various partners from New South Wales Government, the agencies that provide data for linkage, and the Centre for Health and Record Linkage that provides the capacity for us to conduct anonymised linkages of administrative data that's at the heart of this research. So thank you. And I'm now going to hand over to Rochelle Romero, who is Manager of the Interagency Team in the Department of Communities and Justice.
Thank you very much. I'm Rochelle Romero from the Department of Communities and Justice, and I'm from the Interagency Team in Child and Family Strategy. And our role is to work with our agency colleagues to improve the way we work together to better support our children and young people in out-of-home care. Today, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the education pathway process for children in out-of-home care. I'm calling in today and joining you from Darkinjung country on the Central Coast, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and all my Aboriginal colleagues joining us today. Why is the out-of-home care education pathway program so important? The out-of-home care education pathway is really important because children and young people in care experience complex behavioural, emotional, psychological changes that impact on their health and education. Now, this is really important because we want all children to excel in their lives, no matter what their experience or where they live. we want them to experience their academic potential, and we need to pay special attention to vulnerable children and young people. It is important that we work and we plan with urgency, to do good planning with our child or young person to understand their needs, and then to work collaboratively with our education colleagues to address those needs. The Pathway program aims to identify the education needs that our children and young people are experiencing as early as possible through a collaborative planning process that aims to provide the support that each child or young person needs to reach their full learning potential. Now, the pathways were originally established in response to the Wood Commission of Inquiry into Child Protection Services in New South Wales in 2007, which found that there was a lack of unified response, specific policies or recommended standards of education planning for children and young people in out-of-home care. The key recommendations of the inquiry included that all children and young people in out-of-home care undertake education planning and that these processes are monitored and reviewed. So the out-of-home care education pathway is an agreement between DCJ, Department of Communities and Justice, and the 3 education sectors in New South Wales on how children and young people will be supported at school. These include the Department of Education, the Association of Independent Schools, and the Catholic Education Commission. So the MOUs cover both NGO service providers and DCJ managed places and placements. And the education pathway is used for all children in statutory out-of-home care, regardless of which agency manages their case. So it's important to remember that it is never an agreement or a policy or a procedure in itself that creates good outcomes and change. It is our relationships, and that these processes rely on strong relationships between DCJ, education, schools, government, Catholic and independent sectors, and our NGO partners. It is also really important that carers and the child and young person participate in the planning with caseworkers in the schools. Since the initial implementation in 2011, NGOs now play a greater role in the delivery of out-of-home care services. So this means they must also work with New South Wales Health, Education and DCJ to ensure implementation of the pathways. So I'm just going to give you now a quick overview of what the education pathway process looks like for children in out-of-home care. So the pathway commences when a caseworker will notify the school that a child or young person has entered out-of-home care. So this is done by a notice to school form, and it needs to be lodged within 14 days of a child or young person entering out-of-home care, or when a child is in out-of-home care and enrolls in the school for the first time. So this informs the school that the child or young person is under the parental responsibility of the minister, and it enables the school to contribute to the child's case planning, as well as the caseworker to contribute to the child's education planning. It also triggers, if the child goes to a public school, this will also trigger some support funding from the school. This then, as we go to this number 2, this then triggers the personalised learning and support planning process. So the school will arrange the personalised learning and support planning meeting after they receive the notice to school and invite the key stakeholders. It should be a collaborative process, and because we want to act with urgency, it should be done within 30 days from entry into care. Now, a plan is only as good as how it is operationalised, and only as good as the outcome it achieves for the child or young person. The planning process is about doing the actions in the plan, monitoring and reviewing at least annually or when things change for that child or young person, which includes significant transition points. So this pathway process is designed to increase educational outcomes and attendance and decrease suspensions by supporting the learning needs and goals to ensure additional supports are provided. So in terms of the personalised learning and support planning, it is otherwise known as what was mentioned by some of our presenters previously, the ILP, the individual learning plan, or the education plan. And the reason why we've changed the language is because we want it to be not just more than just a plan, we want it to be an ongoing process of monitoring and review. So it's an all-inclusive and collaborative process. And we need to make sure that the carer and the child is involved. This should be done within 30 days of the child or young person entering care or to a new school. And for Aboriginal children and young people attending a Department of Education school, they will have a personalised learning pathway to address their cultural needs as part of the personalised learning support planning process. So it should all be done within the one process. So who should be involved in the personalised learning support planning process, or the PLASP? It is about establishing relationships and building the team around the child to support the child or young person reach their full learning potential. Now, this is an opportunity for caseworkers to ensure that the carer and the child, as well as any other stakeholders that they think are necessary, are part of this process. This may include significant persons where appropriate and health and allied health professionals. The personalised learning and support planning process should be collaborative, meaningful, positive, strengths-based, a way to keep communication open between the schools, caseworker, the child, the carer, and reviewed at least annually, and most importantly, achieves outcomes for the child or young person. The actions and strategies from the personalised learning and support planning process should be built into the case plan. So the information, so this is an opportunity for caseworkers to provide additional supports to the child or young person's formal education with any resources to support learning, such as books, local library membership and internet access. Is there any learning activities outside of the school that the child wants to be involved with? Is there any additional learning support needs, like tutoring, that is needed? So this should be done in partnership with a child and young person and their carer. So the monitoring and review. So this is the review of the personalised learning and support planning is to be done a minimum of once a year. So this is an opportunity to monitor the child's education progress and to celebrate success. So although we are saying that it's a minimum of once a year, we recommend that it's reviewed at least once a semester with the school in conjunction with the school's routine reporting period. And of course, when there's major changes in a child or young person's life, such as a transition to primary or high school or a change of placement, these should trigger a review of the learning and support planning process. Other changes that should trigger a review is change of caseworkers, change of address, change of schools, change of carer, change of agency, restoration, legal status change, or exiting care. The schools should be notified with any of these changes within 7 days of being notified of the change. So it's really important to remember that children and young people and families are at the centre of our work, recognising their intimate and deep understanding of the key challenges and service gaps they face. It is important that we believe in our children and young people and that we set high but fair expectations and we help all children and young people in out-of-home care reach their full learning potential. So in summary, caseworkers should inform the school that the child or young person has entered out-of-home care or is starting school, understand the child or young person's need, and ensure they have a personalised learning support planning initiated within 30 days to ensure that the education needs are met, monitored and reviewed. And through this process, additional supports should be arranged. It is important to be engaged in this process with the child to celebrate the achievements and acknowledge and celebrate when goals have been reached. Continue to, through the learning process, through the planning process, identify the goals, and most importantly, keep the child or young person at the centre of this work. This support is designed to increase educational outcomes, attendance, and to decrease suspensions to support children and young people through their learning journey. I just wanted to mention that in the next week or so, we're going to be releasing an e-learning series, and this will be made available to all caseworkers from DCJ and our NGO providers on the education pathway. So although this is a very quick and brief overview, the e-learning process will go more into depth. I would now like to welcome Trish Ladonia and pass it on to you from Department of Education.
Thanks, Rochelle. Much appreciated. Hi all, my name is Tricia Ladanya. I'm coming to you from the Department of Education. My current role is the Director Behavior Strategy. I can see there's quite a few questions in the chat that are coming my way, so really happy to answer those in the when we get to the panel session. I do want to let you know that I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, and I want to pay my respects to our elders past, present, and future, any Aboriginal people in the room with us today, as the traditional owners of the land on which we're all coming into this meeting. So, the goal of the Department of Education and the New South Wales Government and most of our agencies is to guarantee the best educational opportunities for each of our students, no matter where they live or what their background, throughout their entire educational experience. To do this, we need to build an inclusive education system, one that embeds inclusion into all aspects of school life and is supported, as Rochelle noted, not just by a policy, but by culture and policy and everyday practice. We want to strengthen our system of effective behavior support to create inclusive learning environments so our students in public schools are safe and we have respectful working environments for our teaching staff. We know that explicit use of data enables us to closely monitor student progress and achievement, and it supports our collective responsibility for understanding the needs of every student in our schools. Suspension rates for vulnerable students in New South Wales are high, and they're disproportionately so for students with disability, Aboriginal students, students in rural and remote areas, students in out-of-home care and those in the child protection system, and students experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage. I know you've heard some data previously around that, and this just reiterates that and notes that there's a number of student cohorts that are in that same space. And if you're across some of those categories, that will increase your disproportionality. The data also shows us that the number of students with additional learning needs in our public schools is growing. So for example, the demand for disability support is growing at 4 times the rate of our enrollment growth. We know that students with disability are overrepresented, both in the child protection and the out-of-home care space. Across our public schools, student suspension rates remain too high, and the educational outcomes and attainment for some cohorts of our students is well below that of their peers. The case for change for us is very strong. The findings and recommendations from a series of independent inquiries is also compelling us to adopt system-level reform. For example, the New South Wales Department of Education, along with education departments in all jurisdictions across Australia, is currently receiving scrutiny, and we, the Department of Education in New South Wales, have been subject to adverse comment by the Disability Royal Commission, specifically in relation to inquiries into the barriers to safe, quality, and inclusive school education for students with a disability in our schools. The findings and recommendations from a series of independent the government has made clear its commitment to lifting educational standards and improving the learning outcomes of all students across New South Wales public schools. To this, the Department of Education will be releasing our Inclusive, Engaging, and Respectful Schools reform later this term for implementation in Term 2. The Inclusive, Engaging, Respectful Schools package includes 3 key policy elements. That includes a new policy on inclusive education for students with disability, a new restrictive practices framework and policy outlining how restrictive practices will be used in public schools and the reporting requirements around that, and revised student behavior policy and procedures. Each of these have distinct aims and objectives, but they're fundamentally integrated and interconnected. These projects have been packaged as a single set of changes and supports to ensure schools are in the best position to help all students reach their potential across the entire public education system. It's a student-centered approach, and it provides practical resources for teachers and leaders, on-the-ground support from additional workforce and specialists in behavior and well-being, professional learning and development, including around trauma-informed practice, developed with Berry Street, and clear guidance around how policies and procedures should be implemented across every New South Wales public school. We know that teachers across the state in mainstream schools and in our specialist settings are working hard to achieve some remarkable outcomes. However, we also know that the service provision differs from school to school and that student and family experiences are inconsistent. It's important that the strategies that we provide our schools are based on and backed up by the best available evidence. And to this, we engaged the Telethon Kids Institute to support us to identify contemporary understanding of what works best. And that work underpins the 10 key principles of our student behavior strategy that you can see on the slide here. Violence in our schools is never acceptable, and we do acknowledge suspension needs to remain a critical safeguard if student behavior poses a risk to safety of others. However, and you've heard this already, so I am repeating some evidence, the evidence tells us that suspension has adverse effects on student learning and well-being outcomes. The Australian and international research shows us that exclusionary discipline, such as school suspension, is linked to a range of adverse effects that includes reinforcing those escalating behaviors, disengagement from learning, lower school attendance, increased likelihood of contact with the justice system, and poor long-term health and well-being outcomes. Most importantly, there is no evidence that suspension is an effective mechanism for improving or managing student behavior. Suspension does not provide students with support that they need to achieve behavioral change when they return to the classroom. So the goal of this reform, the Inclusive, Engaging, and Respectful Package, is to provide new and better alternatives to suspension. The Student Behavior Strategy was released by the Minister of Education in March 2021. It's public on our website, and it was only released after a period of full public consultation on the Have My Say government website. We've had over 900 submissions to that consultation process, and there's an outcome report on those submissions also on our website. And that consultation process supported us in developing, along with the evidence, supported us in developing the model for the student behavior strategy that you can see on your screen that's focused around practice, support, ongoing improvement, and systems reform. The ultimate goal of the strategy is to increase student engagement, reduce suspension, and increase attendance. I'm going to talk you through some of the key policy changes that will happen for our schools. So under the student behavior strategy and the inclusive, engaging, and respectful schools, we're lifting the threshold for use of suspension. That means that those grounds for suspension around persistent misbehavior or chronic disobedience will no longer be available as a reason for a suspension. All suspensions will be based on health and safety concerns. We're reducing the maximum days for suspension. So there will be a reduction in the amount of days that students can be suspended. And with that, schools are going to need your help because a suspension is not a punishment. It's about making sure that the risk assessment and the supports are in place for that child so that they can come back to school and learn and be safe in the classroom. When we have shorter suspension days, that means that we're going to need a prompt response to make sure that we get those processes and supports in place for those students when they come back. We are also making a distinction between students in K-2 and 3 to 12 because the research shows very clearly those adverse impacts are most significant for our littlest learners. And we are going to look at so that we'll have caps and limits on suspension and different suspension days for the different groups. We're also putting some timeframes on recurrences and appeals and other things to ensure that there's procedural fairness and it's very clear around what happens. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat a little bit. In-school suspension is also on the cards and we will trial and test that. And there are a number of other range of things that are happening, but I wanted to give you an overview of the policy changes. We've got two really useful resources that are out now. One is our Inclusive Practice Hub, and it is a fantastic array of videos of teachers providing reasonable adjustments to students in examples of that in the classroom. It's very explicit. It's geared towards our workforce, but I think it's really important that you know that it's there and you can have a look as a parent, as a caseworker, as someone who has a child that they're working with that may need additional adjustments. It's quite useful too to have a think about those when you're looking at them from a behavior perspective, because some of the things that are happening around those adjustments help minimize those behavior triggers for students, right? Where perhaps that behavior is because we weren't actually giving them the adjustment they needed for their learning to feel successful. It's a great resource that was developed in consultation and engagement with Deakin University. And if you go to our website and type in Inclusive Practice Hub, it will come up for you. We also have a behavior support toolkit. That has a range of resources that we are adding to as we go, and definitely will look a little bit different in term 2 than it does now once everything is released. But there's a space in there for parents and carers, there's a space in there for teachers and staff, and there's a space in there for leaders. I would encourage you to please go have a look at those. And then finally, just having a chat about how you can help. And there were lots of great suggestions that you've heard around the other presentations. We just really are really clear that our goal is to increase the days that students are at school, and not just that they're in school and they're there, but they're learning and they're engaged and they're feeling a sense of belonging, and it's a good place for them to be. And to do this, we really need your support. We need you to promote and encourage and support learning with the children and young people and families that you work with. We all know that the difference in education can make for an individual student in their life outcomes when it comes to being part of the child protection system. Anytime in your work where you can help support social and emotional skill development is really, really beneficial for us, and particularly in the K-2 cohort who have really experienced quite a bit of learning from home over the past few years because of COVID, and so have not been able to be in a position that they can practice those social and emotional skills with their peers in a classroom the way that other cohorts have had that experience. So that K-2 group in particular, wherever we can support that social and emotional skill development, is really useful and helpful for us. We do want, and I know Rochelle touched on this, but we want to encourage those positive partnerships and build quality relationships. Not just for you with the school and your work, but helping your families and your students engage in those good relationships. It takes a bridge sometimes, and we know that it's really useful when we can have the worker that's working with the family or supporting the carer and the parent just help build that bridge, get that through, get the school on board, get the family feeling confident, and move forward. And I guess that's the conversation around the wraparound support as well. When you're working with a family, before you leave that case, before you decide I've finished my work with this family, one of the questions I would encourage you to ask yourself is, have they engaged in their learning successfully? Are they attending, engaged? Is the family feeling confident to have conversations with the school? Does the carer know their rights and what they need to do to make sure that the student in out-of-home care is getting their planning the way that it needs to be done? Have we got all the services in place? Or if I pull out now, does that mean that the good attendance, the good engagement that we've had is going to fall over? And I think we all have a role there to make sure that schools are supported to be able to do the work that they need to do, and that they are on board with that as well, that we've had a really clear conversation about what works for that family and student. Everybody knows the goals and is able to do that. And so it's one of the things I would just encourage you to do, and you probably already do with your casework, but it would be really important for us in helping us with these changes that will be significant for schools. With that, I also just ask you to have a bit of patience when this rolls out. For some schools, this will be very simple policy reform for them. They will have done this, they do this really well. For other schools, it can be maybe more of a shift and more work to be done. So we have a period of familiarization before it's commence in implementation. Cultural change takes time. We don't expect the policy to come out and everything to change overnight, but we do expect that it'll set the parameters and there will be some compliance issues that are compliance parameters that are in place that will move that forward as well. I am going to hand over, I want to thank you for your time, and I'm going to hand over now to Jade Ward, who's going to speak to you about supporting Aboriginal children and young people in care to reach their educational goals. Thanks, Jade.
Thanks, Tricia. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And as Tricia just said, my name is Jade Ward, and I'm the Director of Transforming Aboriginal Outcomes within the Department of Communities and Justice. Before I begin, I just would like to acknowledge that I'm sitting on Dharawal country. I'd like to acknowledge Aboriginal people as the First Nations people of New South Wales and pay our respects to elders past, present and future. We acknowledge the ongoing connection Aboriginal people have to this land and recognise Aboriginal people as the original custodians of this land. So I'm a Wiradjuri woman and my mum's family are from Cumnock and Condobolin in Western New South Wales. However, I was born and raised on Gadigal country in Sydney, and I'm coming at this presentation from various perspectives. So as a past educator, as a primary school teacher for many years, and then I went into the policy space working as state manager of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education at Catholic Schools New South Wales for 5 years. I've been an Aboriginal carer, foster carer for a couple of years when I lived in Taree, and as an Aboriginal woman, I bring this perspective to you today. And also, of course, working in the Department of Communities and Justice now, working to reduce the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in care. So, as we know, some Aboriginal families face particular challenges when it comes to engaging with schools. So past negative schooling experiences like poverty, unemployment, poor job prospects, inadequate housing, poor physical and mental health, racism, and the living legacy of cultural dislocation continue to affect the lives of many Aboriginal people today. So some Aboriginal parents and carers and families believe that they should not actually interfere with the school system and may not have models of educational success in their family or extended families. So Aboriginal families have many strengths to address these challenges, including through organisations which deliver community-initiated and controlled solutions. So schools can make a big difference by creating a working partnership with Aboriginal families to assist parents or carers in their engagement. So the philosophy of doing with rather than doing at creates a school where Aboriginal families see themselves as active participants, working in partnership with teachers to share their culture and support their child's learning. So we can actually position ourselves in ways that invite respect, curiosity and connection. Or we can also position ourselves in ways that invite judgment, disconnection and disapproval. The stance we take has profound effects on the relationship, and it is shaped by our values and conceptual assumptions. So family school partnerships strengthen the connections between schools and their communities, and partnerships can involve all organisations that support families and schools. So I would strongly encourage you to reach out to your communities and your community organisations to strengthen those partnerships. So I'm sure you've heard of Chris Sara from the Stronger Smarter Institute, and I've been lucky enough to work alongside of the Stronger Smarter Institute in my role as state manager at Catholic Schools. Now, historically, Australian society has conditioned us to have low expectations for Aboriginal students. So what actually happens when we actually lower our expectations for our Aboriginal students as a society, Aboriginal people have actually taken that on and they lower their expectations of themselves. An example that Chris Sara actually gives is when he was a principal in Cherbourg in Queensland. And if you're not familiar with Cherbourg, it's a mission in Queensland, and they used to have the ration shed there and provide the rations to Aboriginal people who lived on the mission. The ration shed is now an educational institution, and it has lots of resources for many educators if you want to visit there. But when he first started at that school, children used to turn up to school at any time they want, and the teachers and the staff and the principal there actually didn't even have a bell. So when he started, the first thing he did was bring back the bell and made sure that the kids, the parents, the families, the carers and community were making sure that they were all turning up on time. So we have to make sure that our expectations are fair, but they are high. So agendas such as closing the gap, where resources are allocated to education systems and schools for Aboriginal children on the basis of a need to catch up, continually uses language that reinforces deficit perspectives. So deficit discourse amongst teachers infers that Aboriginal children are less able to learn than their non-Aboriginal counterparts because of their external situation. So often we will see teachers actually watering down the curriculum, thinking that they're actually helping Aboriginal students when in fact they're actually making the gap wider. So the situation is even made more complex by the fact some Aboriginal people have been so heavily socialised by this deficit colonial gaze that they have come to accept negative stereotypes as part of their identity. So a high expectations relationship is an authentic two-way relationship that is supportive and challenging. Each individual's strengths and capacity are acknowledged and spaces of equal power are created. So cultural, intercultural and conversations processes allow respectful, open dialogue in a safe and trusting environment. So Chris Sarah claims that a relationship is anchored by high expectations when we have the compassion to be fair, by engaging and acknowledging and enabling processes when we can, as well as having the courage to be firm, by challenging and intervening when we need to. So being fair in the relationship is essential to establishing trust and safety. And evidence shows that children who are expected to achieve at school and who have high expectations of themselves are more likely to succeed. Now, this is just an informed practice framework which was taken from the Kids Matter, the Australian Primary School Mental Health Initiative. Now, many qualified teachers experience burnout when working in classrooms where children hold intergenerational trauma. And of course, a lot of our children in care who have been part of that stolen generation and part of those descendants of the stolen generation, there's a lot of intergenerational and transgenerational trauma in those families. So there is a critical need for teachers to better understand trauma, self-care, and appropriate ways of sharing culture with Aboriginal children. So putting Aboriginal students and young people in care, it's vital teachers and schools develop an understanding of the relationship between culture, identity, and healing so they can better support Aboriginal children who have experienced trauma. So research shows that children who have experienced trauma are more vulnerable to developing emotional difficulties after experiencing trauma. So when schools are aware of the effect of trauma and the effect that trauma can have on children's emotions and know, they can then provide the support that children and their families need and the specific needs that those families require. So one way school staff can support Aboriginal children who have experienced trauma is to use practice in the classroom. So the practice in this slide are recommended to support students who have experienced trauma. Now, Aboriginal people are the most over-researched people in the world. So we know what works. We actually know. We've done this a million times. So it's just a matter of actually actioning this stuff. So understanding students' needs, a school culture and leadership that acknowledges and supports Aboriginal students and families, including a shared vision for the school community. We need quality and committed staff members, Aboriginal mentors, high expectations of success for not only our staff, not only our students, but our parents and community, a drive for continuous improvement, a learning environment that is responsive to the individual needs of that student, involvement of the Aboriginal community in planning and providing the education. So school-wide strategies that work to maintain student engagement and improve learning outcomes, including broad curriculum provision. So student-focused strategies that directly meet the needs of students at risk of low achieving or early leaving, including school engagement programs, intensive management, provision of transport and mentoring, school absenteeism and attendance programs, quality vet options, quality career education and targeted skill development. So understanding the students' needs. So one thing, overcrowding, and this is just an example. So it is very difficult for Aboriginal students to learn or do homework in overcrowded houses. So even the brightest of students in these communities will struggle to attain a satisfactory report if they have to compete with members of 3 or more families permanently occupying the same house or dwelling. Now, just important in this 21st students and their identity. And this is a really important way of engaging our students, at school today. So Aboriginal identity in the 21st century, one of the greatest challenges for Aboriginal people is to develop practical models to capture, maintain, and pass on traditional knowledge systems and values to future generations. So Aboriginal culture dates back well over 60,000 years, but the world's oldest surviving civilization continues to play a vibrant role in modern Australian society. So engaging children and young people in our school systems is critical. Teachers across Australia are now required to include Aboriginal perspectives in their teaching for both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal children. So non-Aboriginal children learn to think about Aboriginal people in the past tense, while many teachers overlook the myriad of resources available that narrate and explicate the contemporary lives of Aboriginal people for children. So teaching materials, such as textbooks or films, are entirely based on white models. Aboriginal students cannot identify with their characters, and research has shown that students who aren't represented in textbooks perform worse academically. So I've just thrown in some examples because we know that kids relate to this stuff. This is what they relate to. It may not be contemporary dance. It may, traditional dance or traditional songs. They are online. They are doing digital curriculum. Students. So thank you for listening today, and I'm going to hand it back to Stuart.
Thank you, Jade, and again, thank you to all our presenters. Now we'll just do a quick slight adjustment on the run because we do have to finish at a hard 1:30 today. So just notice that we are running a little bit behind time, so we might need to postpone questions because obviously right now we are joined by Irina Castellano. Very grateful for you making the time to join us. Irina is a carer for many years and also a volunteer with My Forever Family, and I'm grateful for you making the time today to share with us your perspective as a carer in terms of supporting children in your care with achieve educational outcomes. So can I start by inviting you to tell us a bit about yourself and your experience as a carer? Oh, the dreaded mute button.
Yeah. All right. Always happens. There we go. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the custodians of the land and also pay my respect to elders past, present, emerging, and anybody here of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background. And I'm just very grateful for this opportunity, as I've been caring for also quite a few Aboriginal kids over my 21 years of caring now. So it's been a long time, and we've had, roughly about 70 kids come through. Most of them were reunited, which is the whole purpose of fostering, and 2 could not be reunited. So we've also had 2 kids stay with us. So we've got a biological child and 2 adopted children.
Amazing, and thank you, Irina, for your very long experience as a carer. It's safe to say that carers are really the beating heart of our care system, and can't thank you enough. So tell me, children in your care, what have been some of the challenges in relation to helping them achieve their educational needs?
Well, I'm just a huge advocate for not suspending children. And to be honest, for me, this is not just children in out-of-home care. This should be for any child. It has, as much as it has removed them. And yes, I mean, I also teach, so I do get the whole idea of, removing, and especially if maybe there is a risk of safety, but to even just read the chat and to see that, a child has been swearing at the teachers. Of course, there's always 2 sides or 3 sides to every story. But if a child has been swearing and has then been suspended, I mean, you tell me the purpose of the whole thing. So unless there's a safety risk, which is, again, a tiny bit different, I think we all know that suspensions happen without even being a safety risk. It is a behavioral thing in terms of, the behavior being challenging. So for me, we are always told in those 20 years, how many times I've heard that, attention seeking is attention needing, and by somebody playing up, that's attention seeking, and therefore they are attention needing. So by just removing them from the classroom, for me, is not solving anything. I really think that these kids need to be much better supported. And I love in the chat where, I think it was Annie who said, okay, she actually said, get the emotions sorted and then kids will, thrive and so. And then another one said that children that are suspended, there was another really good one in terms of, also with truancy and to do it in school. And this is exactly it. We need to find other mentors, the mentors that somebody suggested to find for universities. When you have students who are doing social service, who are actually, wanting to work, what great experience that would be to actually mentor vulnerable children in schools, match them up, get something going so that these kids have a mentor. In my opinion, at every school, it doesn't matter. I mean, to hear that a child in kindergarten is suspended, for me, that is really horrendous. And for children to actually be supported and have a mentor from the word go, that would be great. And which also comes, for me, ties in with counseling, where very often, counseling is only provided to many kids that are in permanent care. And if you wait until they're in permanent care, which can take, years, 2 years at least, not at least, but, often, then for me, you're wasting valuable time where you could actually prevent things from worsening. If you then start to suddenly make it available with counseling, but the children have already got the identity issues and their behavioral issues galore, then it's quite late for me. It should have been prevented before it all happens, so that they have a person to go to that is already connected with them when the issues start.
Yeah, look, great. I mean, making my job easy as in asking the questions. Is there anything you've seen? I guess you've already named a number of things, but just really building on a theme. So either from schools or from caseworkers, what are the things that they've put in place or that they've done that's really made a difference in your experience?
People being trauma-informed, that they know the trauma-informed practices. I find it a shame, and I mean, I teach community services as well in different venues, and for me to actually see that it is still an elective and not a core unit is heartbreaking. I really think that every single teacher, every single facilitator out there should have the basic in trauma-informed care. It shouldn't be something that you can do or not do, or the principal says, please do this, and some attend, some don't attend. It should be a core unit.
Yeah, great. And look, I'll have to unfortunately make this a final question so that we can wrap up on time. But any advice on things that you've done or seen work about building that really positive attitude towards education for kids in your care?
Look, I mean, I've had caseworkers say in the past, oh, just let them settle, don't worry about the educational thing. But for me, education, for them to fit in, to also say, look, let's go through the words, let's practice for the test on Friday, to then see children turn around and say, wow, nobody ever practiced with me. I've never gone into school on a Friday morning where I actually knew the words. I mean, what that does to the confidence of a child is just tremendous. And to say that, oh, don't worry about the academic side. Well, I had a child stay with us for 3 months, go to school. And then when it was time for the report, it just had on there that, yes, they attended from this date to this date, but it didn't even give much information about the child. And I'm thinking, well, you can't just say, oh, they only attended 3 months, therefore they don't really need a report. I don't know. I get to know my children pretty well in 3 months. So I think that also that is something that needs to change, that, even if kids come temporary in the school, that they actually are given a proper report that maybe is not as detailed as if they would have stayed for a year. But I think where the kid sits within 3 months as well.
Fantastic. And look, and I am dreadfully sorry that we haven't had as much time to take to explore your views on this. I can say from the comments confidently you're getting a lot of support and you've got a lot of people agreeing with what your advice has been. Can I thank you again, Irina, for joining us today and obviously for your many years as a carer and the many children that you've supported in that role. So very grateful for your insights and for your time today.
Thank you. And it would just be great if carers were given more of a chance to also be a part of this, you know, so that it is not just at the end and, you know, here and there. I mean, no offense,
No,
but I think that you really, you can see from the response from carers that they all would love to say something. They all have experiences, and we all can only learn from one another. So the more that we are a part of this as well, and I appreciate the opportunity, but the more that people get a chance to really voice what's going on the ground per se, then that would be great.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Thank you for that. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Look, can I bring us to a close? One final thank you to all our presenters today, to Dr. Miriam Maclean, to Dr. Michelle Townsend, to Dr. Kristen Lawrence, to Rochelle Romero, to Tricia Ladogna, to Jade Ward, and of course to Irina Castellana. Apologies for that pronunciation. Again, it's been a pleasure. Apologies if I had to run over. We will take the questions in the chat and try and come back to everyone with a distribution to some of those answers. The recording will be distributed to everyone who has RSVP'd for today's session in the coming days, so that will be made available. And again, can I just also make a massive thank you to everyone who's taken the time to attend today and taken the time to reflect, to listen, to learn, and to, you know, I guess express that shared passion and commitment to make a difference. So hopefully going forward, we all feel a little bit better informed about how we can support children to achieve their educational goals. So one final time, thank you very much for your attendance, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.